Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases ever recorded in the history of the United States. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. We want to know how far these documented accounts reach and at what moments of day or night they find their listeners. In the autumn of 1837, the St. Louis Hotel in New Orleans was packed with the city's wealthiest men. The auction that evening had drawn an unusual level of interest, even for a city known as the largest slave market in the United States. What made this particular sale different was not the number of human beings on the block, but rather the presence of a single woman who would soon become known throughout the city as the Pearl, a name that would echo through the cobblestone streets of the French Quarter for decades to come. She stood 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with skin described in the auction papers as the color of fresh cream with the slightest hint of coffee. Her eyes were a deep amber that seemed to change color depending on the light, and her hair fell in long, glossy black waves down her back. The auctioneer, a man named Thomas Williams, introduced her simply as Lot Number 17. But those in attendance knew they were witnessing something extraordinary as whispers moved through the crowd like ripples on the Mississippi River. The bidding began at a staggering sum, 5 times the price of an ordinary house servant. What happened next would become one of the most peculiar chapters in the history of New Orleans, a city already infamous for its complex racial hierarchy and the brutal economics of human bondage. It would connect powerful families, unearth forgotten secrets, and eventually lead to a series of disappearances that remained unexplained until 1962, when a renovation project at the old Delacroix mansion on Royal Street uncovered a hidden room containing a leather-bound journal, 3 human finger bones, and a portrait of a woman whose beauty, even captured in aging paint, seemed almost otherworldly. This is the story of Elena Reynolds, known to most as the Pearl, and the terrifying truth behind her disappearance in the winter of 1842. The auction that night in 1837 was recorded by multiple witnesses, including James Thornton, a northern businessman visiting New Orleans to establish cotton trade connections. In his personal diary recovered from his estate in Boston in 1952, Thornton described the scene with evident discomfort. "Have never witnessed such frenzy among gentlemen of standing as occurred tonight at the Hotel Exchange. The woman on sale was indeed remarkable in appearance, yet the behavior of those present seemed driven by something beyond mere desire for human property. One could detect an almost religious fervor in their bidding, as though acquiring this particular slave had significance beyond the material realm." What Thornton couldn't have known was the complex web of history surrounding the woman on the block. Elena Reynolds had not been born into slavery, nor had she come through the traditional channels of the domestic slave trade. According to ship records from the port of New Orleans, she had arrived just 3 weeks earlier on a vessel called the Augusta, listed not as cargo, but as a passenger accompanying a merchant named Marcus Bennett. But by the time the Augusta docked, Bennett was dead, supposedly from a fever contracted in Havana during their journey. With no free papers found among Bennett's possessions, Elena was seized by port authorities and eventually placed for auction. This much was public record. What wasn't known until the discovery of the Delacroix journal was why a woman of such obvious refinement and education had found herself in such circumstances, and why certain families in New Orleans had taken such extraordinary interest in ensuring she would never leave the city. Before we delve deeper into the events of that winter, we must understand the New Orleans that existed in 1837. The city was then a complex mosaic of cultures, economies, and racial classifications, more elaborate than anywhere else in America. Following the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the city had transformed from a French and Spanish colonial outpost to a booming American port where fortunes were made in cotton, sugar, and human beings. New Orleans had developed a 3-tiered racial system unlike the strict black-white division found elsewhere in the South. Between these categories existed the gens de couleur libres, free people of color, many of whom were wealthy property owners who sometimes owned slaves themselves. It was a city of contradictions. Brutal slave markets operated within walking distance of opera houses. Code Noir regulations governed the treatment of slaves, while sophisticated social events called quadroon balls facilitated arrangements between white men and free women of color. Above all, it was a city where appearance and bloodlines carried immense social and legal importance. The difference between freedom and bondage could hinge on a single ancestor, a fact that would prove central to Elena Reynolds' story. The winning bid that night came from Charles Delacroix, a wealthy sugar planter whose family had been in Louisiana since the early French colonial period. Delacroix paid the unprecedented sum of $7,000, enough to purchase an entire plantation of field workers, for a woman who, by all accounts, had no experience with domestic service or field labor. The transaction was recorded by notary William Patterson, whose ledger noted something unusual. Delacroix insisted the bill of sale describe Elena not as a slave, but as a ward to be housed in his Royal Street residence. What happened after Elena was taken to the Delacroix home remains clouded in conflicting accounts. The household staff, interviewed decades later by a journalist from the Daily Picayune, recalled that she was treated not as a servant but as a guest, given a private room in the family quarters, and provided with clothing befitting a society woman. Yet she was never seen leaving the property, and visitors to the house reported that Delacroix introduced her as his distant cousin from France who spoke little English. According to household records, Delacroix's wife, Isabelle, left for her family home in Natchez just 2 weeks after Elena's arrival, taking their 3 children with her. She would not return for nearly 6 months. During this period, Charles Delacroix closed his Royal Street house to all visitors and conducted his business affairs entirely through written correspondence delivered by his private secretary. The mystery deepened when in January of 1838, Dr. Samuel Lawrence was summoned to the Delacroix home to attend to Elena, who was reportedly suffering from a persistent cough. Dr. Lawrence's medical journal, preserved in the archives of Chilean University, contained an entry that read, "Called to attend to young woman at the Delacroix residence. Patient exhibits symptoms consistent with consumption, though her overall constitution appears sound. What troubles me more is the evident distress in her manner. When alone, she asked if I knew of her true circumstances before her arrival in New Orleans." Before I could respond, Delacroix returned to the room, and she spoke no further on the matter. Dr. Lawrence noted that he prescribed a standard treatment of bed rest and tonics, but also recorded his impression that the lady's ailment seemed as much of the spirit as of the body, but he was never called back to the house. By spring of that year, rumors had begun to circulate through New Orleans society about the mysterious beauty of the Delacroix mansion. Some claimed she was Charles Delacroix's illegitimate daughter, others that she was his mistress brought from abroad. The most persistent rumor, however, was that she was somehow connected to the Villers family, one of the oldest and most secretive lineages in Louisiana, whose patriarch, Henry Villers, had been among the most aggressive bidders at the auction before Delacroix's winning offer. The Villers family had built their fortune in the early days of the colony, controlling vast sugar plantations and, according to local legend, engaging in privateering during the War of 1812. By 1837, they had largely withdrawn from public life, maintaining their estate on the outskirts of the city and rarely participating in society events. What connected them to a young woman newly arrived from Havana? This question would remain unanswered for more than a century. The Delacroix Journal, discovered during renovations in 1962, provided the first real insight into Elena's life in the mansion. The journal, written in a precise, educated hand, began in February 1838. The early entries were mundane, recording weather conditions and brief notes about books read or meals taken. But as winter gave way to spring, the entries became more revealing. March 11, 1838, C has agreed to allow me access to the family library, though I'm still forbidden from venturing beyond the inner courtyard. When I asked why I must remain hidden away, he said only that it was for my protection. From what, he will not say. I begin to fear that the story he told me about my papers being processed is merely a fiction to keep me compliant. And later, April 23, 1838, today C brought a visitor, an elderly man named Villers, who stared at me with such intensity that I felt as though he was searching for something in my features. They spoke in French, believing I could not understand about the resemblance and the bloodline. When I later asked C about this conversation, he became agitated and reminded me of my precarious position. Without free papers, I remain legally his property regardless of my true history. The journal entries became increasingly distressed as Elena apparently began to realize that Delacroix had no intention of securing her freedom as he had initially promised. By summer, she was planning an escape. July 17, 1838, I have managed to make contact with a housemaid who has agreed to deliver a message to the offices of the American consul. If my mother's story was true, my birth in Philadelphia should be sufficient to establish my free status. Regardless of my appearance, I must act quickly before C makes good on his threat to send me to his plantation if I continue to cause difficulties. The next entry, dated August 2nd, contained a single line. It was a trap. The maid informed C of my plan. I am to be moved tomorrow. The journal then fell silent for nearly a month. When entries resumed in September, Elena was writing from Beau Refuge, the Delacqua sugar plantation 50 miles downriver from New Orleans. Her situation had clearly deteriorated. September 5, 1838, I am kept in the former overseer's house, separate from both the main residence and the slave quarters. A woman named Martha has been assigned to attend to my needs, though I suspect her primary role is to report my activities to the plantation manager. I have seen C only once since my arrival, when he came to inform me that any further attempts to contact outside authorities would result in my being reclassified as a field worker. The meaning was clear enough. It was at Beau Refuge that Elena's story intersected with another mysterious figure in the narrative, Joseph Miller, a northern abolitionist who had infiltrated Louisiana society posing as a doctor interested in treating slave ailments. Miller's coded correspondence with anti-slavery activists in Boston, decoded and published in 1949, made reference to a woman of unusual circumstance held at the Delacqua plantation who claims to have been born free in Philadelphia to a mother who was herself a free woman. Miller apparently managed to speak with Elena briefly during a visit to Beau Refuge in October 1838. He wrote, "The subject has reason to believe her imprisonment is connected not to ordinary human trafficking, but to some matter of inheritance and identity that threatens powerful interests in this region. She begs assistance in contacting authorities in Philadelphia who might have record of her birth and parentage." Miller promised to investigate her claims, but his work in Louisiana came to an abrupt end in November 1838 when his true purpose was discovered. He narrowly escaped the state with his life. There is no record that he ever managed to pursue Elena's case further. Elena's journal entries from Beau Refuge grew increasingly infrequent through the winter of 1838 into 1839. She recorded her observations of plantation life, her failed attempts to convince household servants to aid her, and her growing suspicion that her confinement had some purpose beyond mere ownership. December 12, 1838, I overheard the plantation manager speaking with a visitor about the Villers' inheritance and the problem of verification, and when they realized I was within earshot, they fell silent and separated. Later, I asked Martha if she knew anything about the Villers family. She grew pale and refused to speak on the subject, saying only that they were not people to be trifled with. What connection could I possibly have to them? The mystery deepened in February 1839 when, according to the journal, Elena received an unexpected visitor. Henry Villers himself, now quite elderly, came to Beau Refuge without Delacqua's knowledge or permission. February 26, 1839, the old man came alone, dismissing Martha from the house. He asked about my mother, specifically whether she had possessed a gold locket with an engraving of a ship. When I confirmed that she had worn such a piece until her death, he nodded as though something had been confirmed. He then asked if I knew the circumstances of my father's death. I told him what mother had always said, that he was a French merchant who died at sea before my birth. At this, the old man made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Your mother was a prudent woman," he said, "but perhaps too prudent for your own good." He left without explaining further, promising to return, though I am not certain whether to hope for or dread such a visit. Henry Villers never did return to Beau Refuge. 3 days after his visit to Elena, he was found dead in his study, apparently from natural causes related to his advanced age. His death, however, set in motion a complex legal battle over the substantial Villers estate, as Henry had died without a male heir. His nearest relative was a nephew named Louis Villers, who immediately filed to claim the inheritance. It was during this inheritance dispute that the connection between Elena and the Villers family began to emerge, at least in the pages of her increasingly fragmented journal. In April 1839, she wrote, "April 9, 1839, C arrived in a state of great agitation, demanding to know exactly what the old man had said to me. When I related our brief conversation, he became even more disturbed. Did he mention any documents?" he asked repeatedly. "Any papers he might have given your mother?" I told him truthfully that the old man had mentioned nothing of the sort. C then searched my room thoroughly before leaving, taking with him my mother's Bible, the only possession I had managed to keep with me from Philadelphia. Within its pages were my mother's few letters and papers, including my certificate of birth. I fear I have now lost the only proof of who I truly am. and the journal's final entries suggest that Elena had begun to piece together the truth of her situation. In an entry dated June 17, 1839, she wrote, "I now understand why I was brought here. It was never about my value as property, but about preventing me from claiming what might rightfully be mine. My mother once told me that my father's family had rejected her, but she never explained why. If what I now suspect is true, then my father was not simply a French merchant, but a Villers, perhaps even Henry's son. And if documentation of such a connection exists, it would explain C's desperate efforts to keep me hidden away and classified as a slave rather than a potential claimant to one of the largest fortunes in Louisiana." This theory aligned with rumors that had long circulated in New Orleans about Henry Villers' estranged son, Jean Baptiste, who had allegedly formed a relationship with a free woman of color in Philadelphia in the early 1800s. According to these rumors, Jean Baptiste had been disowned by his father, but may have secretly married the woman before his death at sea in 1817, the year of Elena's birth. If Elena was indeed Jean Baptiste's legitimate daughter, and if proof of the marriage existed, she would have had a claim to the Villers' inheritance under French inheritance laws that still influenced Louisiana's unique legal code. Such a claim would have been unprecedented and scandalous, as it would have meant recognizing a woman with African ancestry, however minimal, as the rightful heir to one of Louisiana's most prestigious white family fortunes. The final dated entry in Elena's journal was from September 3, 1839. She wrote, "I have found a way. The riverboat stops here tomorrow to take on sugar. Martha has agreed to help me in exchange for the pearl earrings Mother left me. If all goes well, I will be in New Orleans by nightfall, and from there I can seek passage north. I must find those papers before it is too late." The journal ends there, leaving historians to piece together what happened next through other sources. According to Beau Refuge plantation records, a female slave matching Elena's description was indeed reported missing on September 4, 1839. A substantial reward was offered for her return, but the primary search focused on riverboats heading north toward free territories. Instead, evidence suggests that Elena made her way back to New Orleans, perhaps intending to search the Delacroix townhouse for her mother's papers before leaving the South. A receipt from a French quarter apothecary dated September 7, 1839 shows the purchase of women's toiletries charged to the account of Marie Laveau, the famous voodoo priestess who was known to sometimes shelter fugitives within her extensive network. For almost 3 years, Elena Reynolds seemingly vanished from all records. The Villers inheritance case proceeded with Louis Villers ultimately being confirmed as the rightful heir in 1841, after no other claimants came forward with sufficient proof of relation. Charles Delacroix, after an initial aggressive search for his missing property, appeared to abandon the pursuit, focusing instead on resolving mounting financial difficulties that had begun to plague his once prosperous sugar operations. Then in January 1842, Elena Reynolds reappeared in New Orleans society in a manner that shocked even that scandal-accustomed city. She attended the annual Mardi Gras ball at the St. Louis Hotel, the very building where she had been sold 5 years earlier, not as a slave or servant, but as the elegantly attired companion of Louis Villers, the new head of the Villers family. Multiple witnesses described the sensation caused by her entrance. The society columnist for the Daily Picayune wrote, "The mysterious beauty on the arm of Mr. Villers caused all conversation to cease momentarily as they entered the ballroom. She was adorned in a gown of midnight blue silk that emphasized her extraordinary complexion and bearing. Those who had attended certain transactions at the same venue some years prior exchanged significant glances, though none dared make explicit reference to the lady's previous appearance there." What arrangement existed between Elena and Louis Villers remains uncertain. Some historians suggest he may have purchased her freedom secretly, while others propose a more complex scenario in which Elena had obtained leverage over the Villers' heir through discovery of documents related to her parentage. What is clear is that their public appearance together represented an unprecedented breach of New Orleans' social boundaries, regardless of Elena's ambiguous racial classification. Charles Delacroix was also in attendance at the ball that night. According to multiple accounts, he grew visibly distressed upon seeing Elena with Louis Villers, attempting to approach them before being physically restrained by friends. He left the event shortly thereafter. 3 days later, he filed a legal complaint claiming that Louis Villers had unlawfully taken possession of human property rightfully belonging to the Delacroix estate. The complaint was quietly withdrawn within 24 hours. On February 12, 1842, Elena and Louis Villers were seen boarding a steamship bound for France. According to passenger manifests, they traveled as Mr. Louis Villers and Ward. They left behind a New Orleans already ablaze with rumor and speculation. They would never return to American soil. And here the documented history might have ended were it not for the events that unfolded at the Delacroix mansion 2 weeks after their departure. On February 27, 1842, neighbors reported unusual activity at the normally quiet Delacroix residence on Royal Street. Lights burned through the night and servants were seen carrying large trunks to waiting carriages. By morning, the house stood empty, with no formal announcement of the family's departure. When creditors arrived days later to inquire about mounting unpaid debts, they found the house abandoned, though apparently not in haste. Clothes remained in wardrobes, books on shelves, and food in the pantry, as though the occupants expected to return shortly. Charles Delacroix, his wife Isabelle, and their 3 children had vanished. Initial assumptions that they had fled creditors gave way to more sinister theories when in March 1842, the bodies of 2 men were discovered in the swampland outside the city. They were identified as Delacroix's private secretary and his plantation manager from Beau Refuge. Both had been killed by a single gunshot to the head, execution style. A police investigation was launched but yielded few results. The detective in charge, James Morrison, noted in his report that individuals connected to this case seem remarkably reluctant to provide information, suggesting that forces beyond ordinary criminal matters may be involved. The investigation was officially suspended in June 1842. For more than a century, the disappearance of the Delacroix family remained one of New Orleans's most enduring mysteries, occasionally revived in newspaper articles or local histories, but never resolved. Then in 1962, the renovation of the long-vacant Delacroix mansion uncovered the hidden room containing Elena's journal, the finger bones, and the portrait. The journal provided crucial insights into Elena's captivity, but ended before her reappearance in 1842. The finger bones, when examined by forensic anthropologists in 1964, were determined to belong to a male who had died approximately 120 years earlier, roughly the time of the Delacroix disappearance. DNA testing, when it became available decades later, was inconclusive due to the condition of the remains. It was the portrait that perhaps offered the most tantalizing clue. The painting, executed in the style of prominent New Orleans portrait artists of the period, showed Elena Reynolds in an elegant blue gown, possibly the same one described at the Mardi Gras ball. But X-ray examination of the canvas in 1975 revealed another image underneath, a family portrait showing a man, woman, and young girl. Art historians identified the hidden subjects as Jean-Baptiste Villers, his wife, and their infant daughter based on comparison with other Villers family portraits from the period. The existence of this painting strongly supported the theory that Elena was indeed the legitimate daughter of Jean-Baptiste Villers and thus potentially entitled to the Villers fortune. But why was this crucial evidence hidden in the Delacroix house rather than in Elena's possession when she fled with Louis Villers? A partial answer emerged in 1982 when a collection of letters was discovered during the cataloging of the Villers family papers donated to the historic New Orleans collection. The letters, exchanged between Louis Villers and an unnamed correspondent in Paris between 1841 and 1842, suggested a far more complex scenario than had previously been imagined. In one letter dated December 1841, Louis wrote, "The arrangement is proceeding as planned. I have made contact with the subject and explained our mutual interest in resolving this matter quietly. She is understandably suspicious, but sees the logic in cooperation rather than continued conflict. D remains the primary obstacle, as his financial entanglements with my late uncle make him particularly resistant to any settlement that might expose their previous dealings." A subsequent letter from January 1842 stated, "The documents have been verified by my attorney. There can be no doubt as to their authenticity or their legal implications. Had these papers come to light during the inheritance proceedings, the outcome would have been quite different. However, our present arrangement satisfies all parties. She gains her freedom and a suitable settlement while the family avoids both scandal and financial restructuring. D alone remains unpacified, but I believe his economic circumstances will eventually compel his cooperation." These cryptic communications suggested that Louis Villers had discovered proof of Elena's legitimate claim to the Villers inheritance, but had offered her a private settlement, likely including her freedom and financial compensation in exchange for her silence and cooperation in keeping the matter from becoming public. This arrangement would have protected the Villers family reputation while satisfying Elena's most immediate desire for liberty. But Charles Delacroix, having paid an enormous sum for Elena and perhaps being privy to financial irregularities in Henry Villers' dealings, was not included in this arrangement. The letters imply that he posed an ongoing threat to the resolution, perhaps through his knowledge of the situation or through legal claims he might make regarding Elena's status. The final letter in the collection, dated February 1842, shortly before the Delacroix family's disappearance, contained only a brief message. "The problem has resolved itself in a most unexpected manner. I believe no further action will be required on your part. We sail as planned on the 12th. What exactly transpired in those early February days of 1842? No definitive evidence has ever emerged, but historians and criminal investigators who have studied the case have constructed a plausible sequence of events. Upon seeing Elena at the Mardi Gras ball, Charles Delacroix realized that his valuable property had not only escaped but had formed an alliance with Louis Villers. Desperate both financially and to maintain his social standing, Delacroix may have attempted blackmail, threatening to expose whatever arrangement had been made regarding the Villers' inheritance. Louis and Elena, preparing to depart for France, would have had strong motivation to ensure Delacroix's silence. The timing of their departure on February 12th and the Delacroix family's disappearance just 15 days later suggests a connection. The murdered secretary and plantation manager may have been eliminated as witnesses to whatever occurred at the Delacroix home. The finger bones found in the hidden room have never been positively identified, but their presence alongside Elena's journal and the concealed portrait points to a violent conclusion to the Delacroix family's story. In 1968, French police records were discovered that shed the final piece of light on the mystery. A report dated May 1842 documented the arrival in Paris of L. Villers and companion E. Reynolds, and noted that they had taken up residence in a fashionable district using funds from a substantial bank draft issued by the Villers family's New Orleans representatives. They apparently lived quietly in France for several years before relocating to England in 1847. English census records from 1851 list an Eleanor Villers residing in London with Eleanor described as wife rather than ward. They had 2 children by this time. The family remained in England until at least 1861, after which they disappear from public records. As for the Delacroix family, no trace of them was ever found. Their abandoned Royal Street house remained unoccupied for decades, acquiring a reputation as one of the most haunted properties in a city known for its ghostly residents. Local legend held that on certain nights, particularly during carnival season, the sounds of a struggle could be heard from within the empty house, followed by a woman's triumphant laughter. The case of Elena Reynolds represents a rare documented instance where the brutal economics of the slave system collided with the complex racial and inheritance laws of Louisiana, resulting in a chain of events that culminated in multiple disappearances and likely murders. It serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of a society built on racial categorization and human bondage, where a person's freedom, identity, and very life could depend on ancestry and appearance. The portrait of the Pearl now hangs in the historic New Orleans collection, a silent testament to a woman who refused to accept the fate that powerful men had designed for her. Her journal, with its eloquent account of captivity and resistance, has become an important primary source for historians studying the experiences of those trapped in the peculiar institution of American slavery. The final entry in the museum catalog describing Elena's portrait contains a fitting epitaph. This painting depicts a woman who, through extraordinary circumstances, navigated one of the most rigid social systems in American history to reclaim her freedom and identity. What remains unknowable is the full human cost of her journey. In 1969, during further renovations of the Delacroix mansion, workers discovered a small cavity beneath the floorboards of the hidden room. Inside was a gold locket containing a miniature painting of a ship at sea, engraved on the back with the initials J.V. and Mr. Jean Villers and presumably Elena's mother, along with the date February 20, 1816, 9 months before Elena's birth. The locket, like Elena herself, had traversed the boundaries between worlds, between slavery and freedom, between black and white, between the known and the unknown. It now resides alongside her portrait in the museum collection, two artifacts from a story that continues to haunt the collective memory of a city built on secrets. The hidden room in the Delacroix house has since been preserved as part of the building's historical restoration. Tour guides tell visitors about the mysterious woman who was once sold at auction in the St. Louis Hotel, her connection to one of the city's most prominent families, and her eventual escape to Europe. What they cannot tell with certainty is what happened to those who sought to keep her enslaved. Like many of the darkest chapters in American history, some truths remain buried beneath layers of time, silence, and complicity. Perhaps that is fitting. In a city built on unstable ground where the dead rest in above-ground tombs because the water table is too high for conventional burials, some secrets inevitably rise to the surface. Others remain submerged, known only through fragments and whispers, like the sound of distant laughter carried on the warm night air of the French Quarter. In 1958, nearly a decade before the discovery of Elena's journal, a curious incident occurred that some historians believe may be connected to her story. An elderly woman named Margaret Wilson arrived in New Orleans claiming to be the great-granddaughter of Elena Reynolds. She carried with her a stack of letters reportedly written by Elena from London between 1852 and 1868, addressed to a former house servant from the Villers estate who had remained loyal to her. The letters, if authentic, revealed that Elena and Louis had indeed married in France, where the racial restrictions that would have forbidden their union in Louisiana did not apply. They had lived comfortably on the settlement Louis had arranged from the Villers estate, raising 3 children who were brought up with no knowledge of their mother's ordeal in America. Elena had apparently found a measure of peace in her new life, though she wrote of recurring nightmares about her time at Beau Refuge and of a terrible necessity that had preceded her departure from New Orleans. Most significantly, one letter dated October 1867 made cryptic reference to the Delacroix family's fate. "I am still haunted by what Elle felt compelled to arrange that February night. Though I know it was deemed necessary for our security, I cannot reconcile myself to the thought of the children. Elle assures me they were sent away beforehand, but I have no way to verify this, and it troubles my conscience greatly. If they did indeed survive, they would be grown now, perhaps with children of their own, who know nothing of their connection to me or the events that scattered their family to the winds." Margaret Wilson submitted these letters to the Louisiana Historical Society for authentication, but died suddenly of a heart attack before the process could be completed. The letters disappeared from the Society's temporary holdings shortly thereafter, with the official report suggesting they had been mistakenly discarded during an office renovation. No family members came forward to claim Wilson's effects, and the trail went cold once again. Then in 1976, a researcher named Thomas Lawrence, working on a comprehensive history of New Orleans slave markets, uncovered shipping records from March 1842 that documented 3 children traveling unaccompanied from New Orleans to Havana. The children's ages matched those of the Delacroix offspring, though they traveled under the surname Reynolds. Their guardian was listed as Martha Bernard, a name that appeared in Elena's journal as the servant assigned to watch over her at Beau Refuge Plantation. This discovery lent credence to Elena's suggestion in the purported Wilson letters that the Delacroix children had been spared whatever fate befell their parents. It also implied a level of planning and coordination that went beyond a simple act of revenge or elimination of threats. If Elena and Louis had arranged for the children's safe passage to Cuba before dealing with Charles and Isabelle Delacroix, it suggested a complexity of moral reasoning that defied simple categorization. Cuban records showed no further trace of the children or their guardian after their arrival in Havana. Had they been absorbed into the local community, perhaps taken in by one of the many French-speaking families fleeing revolution? Or had they been sent further afield, perhaps to Europe or South America, to ensure they could never return to claim their heritage or seek retribution? In the summer of 1981, during an unusually severe drought that caused the Mississippi River to reach record low levels, a local fisherman made a grim discovery in a normally submerged area near the former site of Beau Refuge Plantation. The receding waters had exposed the remnants of an old flatboat containing human remains, a man, woman, and 2 adult males. Forensic examination determined that all four had died from gunshot wounds to the head and that the bodies had been weighted down with iron chains before the boat was scuttled in deep water. The remains were too deteriorated for positive identification, but personal effects found with the bodies included a pocket watch engraved with the initials CD and a woman's locket containing a miniature portrait of three children who bore a striking resemblance to descriptions of the young Delacroix heirs. The estimated time of death, based on the limited forensic techniques available, was consistent with the Delacroix family's disappearance in 1842. This discovery provided the most compelling evidence yet for what many had long suspected. Charles and Isabelle Delacroix, along with two male associates, likely the secretary and plantation manager whose bodies had been found in the swamp shortly after the family's disappearance, had been executed and disposed of in the Mississippi River. The careful concealment suggested not a crime of passion but a calculated elimination of witnesses and potential threats. What remained unclear was the extent of Elena's involvement in this final brutal resolution. Had she been an active participant in planning retribution against those who had enslaved her, or had Louis Villers acted independently to remove obstacles to their future together? The execution-style killings pointed to experienced hands, possibly men in Louis Villers' employ rather than the aristocratic heir himself. But the precision with which the Delacroix children had been separated from their parents before the killings suggested Elena's influence, a last act of mercy from a woman who had herself been torn from her family. In 1994, the final piece of the puzzle emerged when an architectural historian researching the Villers family estate outside New Orleans discovered a sealed compartment within the master bedroom's fireplace mantel. Inside was a small leather pouch containing a handwritten confession signed by Louis Villers and dated February 25, 1842, 2 days before the Delacroix family's disappearance. The confession stated, "What I have set in motion cannot be undone, nor would I undo it if I could. The elimination of Charles and Isabelle Delacroix has become necessary not merely for my own interests but for ease, safety, and freedom." Their claims against her would follow us even to Europe, and D's financial desperation makes him unpredictable and dangerous. I have arranged for the children to be taken to Cuba, where Martha has contacts among the Freckles community who will ensure they are raised in comfort, though with no knowledge of their true parentage. E insisted on this mercy, though I argued it creates future risk. I could not deny her this, having witnessed the depth of her suffering at their father's hands. The men I have engaged for the task are reliable and have been well compensated for both their service and their silence. They understand that any breach of confidence will result in their own elimination. The plan will be executed tomorrow night when the household is at rest. The bodies will never be found. I record this truth not out of remorse, but to ensure that should questions arise after our departure, there will exist at least one account of what truly occurred and why it was necessary. May God, if he exists, judge me as he sees fit. The confession was authenticated by handwriting experts as matching other examples of Louis Villers' script. Its discovery settled the question of responsibility for the Delacroix killings while raising new questions about the moral complexity of the case. Louis had acted as judge, jury, and executioner by proxy, ordering the deaths of 4 people to secure his and Elena's future. Yet in the context of 1840s New Orleans, the legal system offered no justice or protection for Elena. She existed in a society that had commodified her, denied her humanity, and would have continued to enslave her despite her legitimate claim to freedom and even wealth. In 2002, DNA testing was performed on remains from a London cemetery where parish records indicated an Elena Villers, formerly of America, had been buried in 1872. The results were compared with genetic material recovered from the finger bones found in the hidden room of the Delacroix mansion. The tests confirmed a biological relationship suggesting the finger bones likely belonged to Charles Delacroix, a gruesome trophy that had somehow been preserved in the secret room alongside Elena's journal and the concealed family portrait. Elena Reynolds Villers died at the age of 55, having lived more than half her life as a free woman in Europe. According to London church records, her funeral was well attended by family and numerous friends, suggesting she had found community and perhaps even happiness in her adopted country. Louis Villers outlived her by 6 years, dying in 1878. Their 3 children married into respectable English families, their mother's racial background and extraordinary history apparently unknown to their spouses or social circles. As for the Delqua children, despite extensive research by historians and descendants of both the Vars and Diaqua families, no definitive trace of them has ever been found in Cuban records or elsewhere. They vanished into history, casualties of a system that had valued human beings as property and bloodlines as determinants of worth. Their disappearance represents yet another cost of America's peculiar institution, the orphaning of children whose parents had participated in and benefited from a moral atrocity. The story of Alelina Reynolds stands as testament to the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit in the face of institutionalized cruelty. Born to a free woman of color and the disinherited son of a wealthy plantation owner, she navigated the treacherous waters of racial classification, enslavement, and ultimately violent liberation. Her journey from auction block to London drawing rooms encompassed the full spectrum of experiences possible for a woman of mixed racial heritage in the 19th century. Today, visitors to the historic New Orleans collection can view Alelina's portrait, the hidden family painting beneath it, and the gold locket that linked her to her true parentage. These artifacts, along with her journal, constitute one of the most complete records of the inner life of a woman caught in the machinery of American slavery, but they tell only part of the story. The rest exists in silences, in the absence of the Delacqua family from subsequent history, in the unknown fate of their children, in the gaps between journal entries, and in the moral ambiguities inherent in acts of violence committed in the name of justice when no legal justice was available. In recent years, descendants of the Villers family have established a scholarship fund for African American students studying law named in Alelina Reynolds' honor. The fund's creation was accompanied by a formal acknowledgement of Alelina's place in the family lineage and an apology for the actions of Henry Vars in denying her father's marriage and her rightful heritage. It represents a small step toward reconciliation with a history that continues to shape American society and its institutions. The former Delacqua mansion on Royal Street, after changing hands multiple times, now operates as a small historic hotel. Guests occasionally report unusual phenomena. The sound of a woman's footsteps in the night, items moved from where they were left, and most commonly a feeling of being watched in the vicinity of the hidden room, which has been preserved as a historical feature of the building. Whether these are manifestations of restless spirits or simply the power of suggestion in a city steeped in stories of the supernatural remains a matter of individual belief. What is certain is that the walls of that house absorbed the suffering of a woman who refused to accept the identity forced upon her, who fought, survived, and ultimately transcended the boundaries erected to contain her. Alelina's journal ends with her plans for escape, but her story continued long after those final written words. She transformed herself from property to person, from captive to free woman, from victim to perhaps even avenger. In doing so, she embodied the fundamental contradiction at the heart of American slavery, the persistent, undeniable humanity of those whom the system attempted to reduce to mere commodities. In the end, the bizarre mystery of the pearl is not merely a tale of auction blocks and hidden rooms, of forged documents and midnight escapes, of love across racial boundaries, or even of murder concealed by flowing waters. It is the story of a woman who insisted on writing her own narrative in a time and place determined to write it for her. That she succeeded even at terrible cost stands as both inspiration and indictment, a complex legacy that continues to resonate in a nation still grappling with the long shadow of its founding sin. As night falls over the French Quarter and gas lamps cast their flickering glow across cobblestone streets, tour guides still point out the Delacqua house to visitors eager for tales of ghosts and scandal. Few among them recognize that they walk daily over ground where human beings were once bought and sold, or that beneath the Mississippi's muddy surface may lie the bones of those who participated in that commerce. The river keeps its secrets, as does the city built precariously beside it. But occasionally, when conditions are just right, when waters recede or walls are opened or long-sealed documents come to light, the truth emerges, demanding acknowledgement. In those moments, we glimpse not just the specific horrors endured by Alelina Reynolds and inflicted by Charles Dica, but the larger horror of a society built on such relationships. Perhaps that is why Alelina's portrait continues to draw visitors who stand before it in lengthy contemplation. In her amber eyes, expertly rendered by an unnamed artist, one can see both suffering and determination, the vulnerability and strength. She gazes not at the viewer but slightly past towards something or someone beyond our field of vision. What she sees there, judgment, redemption, or simply the next chapter in her extraordinary life, remains as mysterious as the woman herself. In 2019, a team of forensic scientists and historians used advanced imaging technology to examine the hidden portrait beneath Alelina's painting in unprecedented detail. The results confirmed what had long been suspected. The family portrayed was indeed Jean-Baptiste Villers, his wife Marie Reynolds, and their infant daughter. More surprisingly, spectral analysis of the paint revealed that Alina herself had likely been the artist who painted over the original portrait, using similar pigments and techniques to create her own image atop that of her family. The act represented both concealment and reclamation, a palimpsest of identity that mirrored her own complex journey. And so the story ends where it began, with an image of a woman whose extraordinary beauty belied an even more extraordinary spirit. The mystery of the pearl may never be fully resolved, but in its outline sketched from journals and letters, ship manifests and court records, confessions and DNA results, we see reflected the larger American mystery of race, identity, and the human capacity to both inflict and overcome injustice. As you leave this account of Alelina Reynolds' life, consider that the ground beneath your feet holds countless similar stories never recorded, never discovered, never told. For every Alelina who managed to leave behind a journal and portrait, thousands of others disappeared into history without trace, their struggles and triumphs known only to a God who, one hopes, kept better records than human institutions. Their collective silence echoes still on warm southern nights when the air hangs heavy with jasmine and the distant sound of riverboats, in a city where beauty and cruelty have always existed in uncomfortable proximity. Listen closely and you might hear them. The voices of those who, like Alelina, refused to be merely what others declared them to be. Their whispers remind us that the past is never truly past, that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that the human spirit once awakened to its own worth cannot be contained by any system, no matter how entrenched or powerful. In the words written on the back of Alelina's portrait when it was donated to the historic New Orleans collection in 1974, remember her not for her beauty, which was remarkable, nor for her suffering, which was immense, but for her determination to exist on her own terms in a world that offered her no place. In this she achieved what few of any race or station can claim. She wrote herself into being.